I remember, for example, one time we had this really incredibly tragic murder at a Starbucks in D.C. It happened to be right up near his house when he was the chief of the homicide section. He got the call, heard the call early in the morning. He went to the scene, and the three young kids who'd been killed in a robbery, a botched robbery, were still there on the scene. And he was there sort of helping to coordinate things. He ended up taking that case on. And he came back into my office afterwards. And, here's a guy who'd been through Vietnam, had been shot in combat at Vietnam. And he was really, he was really touched and upset by what he'd seen about what had happened to these three young kids. And just gave me an insight into how much he cared about these cases.
Something is changing in our country, and most people feel it before they can explain it.
Hi all, I'm Steve Bunnell. I'm here today with Ken Wainstein on the Steady State Sentinel podcast. And we're here today to talk about the ideals of federal prosecution, and we're going to use a legendary federal prosecutor and former FBI director by the name of Bob Mueller as an example of some of those ideals. There's been a lot of discussion lately about the role of federal prosecutors and the appropriate exercise of discretion by federal prosecutors. And so we thought we would talk a little bit about that. So before we dig in, both Ken and I are longtime federal prosecutors or former federal prosecutors, but we'll give just a very high level sense of where we're coming from in terms of our background. I'm currently practicing law in a small firm in D.C., but I spent over 17 years as a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. and at Main Justice, including working with Ken and working with Bob Mueller, and I served as the criminal chief in the U.S. Attorney's Office towards the end of my career. Ken, talk a little bit about your background and ways that it intersected with DOJ and Bob Mueller.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Good to be here with you. So just in short, my background is I was a federal prosecutor and assistant U.S. attorney in two different U.S. attorney's offices, and both in New York and Southern District of New York and then D.C. And in D.C., I was in the homicide section for quite a while, and that's where I worked with you and with Bob. And then after that, I bounced around DOJ, was at Main Justice for a while, and then went to join Bob over at the FBI. I was his general counsel and his chief of staff. Came back, I was U.S. Attorney, Assistant Attorney General, and all told, I think I was in DOJ for about 18 years, and enjoyed every minute of it.
I think one of the topics that we want to focus on here is, what makes the role of a federal prosecutor different from other attorney jobs. And one of the big differences starts from the fact that the United States is not an ordinary client. They are different. Their interests are not those of a private party. Their interests are the public interest. There is a mission to the job. And it's a job that requires you not only to be skilled in the law and the sort of technical aspects of developing evidence, but it requires you to exercise sound discretion, prosecutorial discretion, which is a unique thing for a lawyer. You don't get to do that in the same way, certainly in the private sector. There's an element of that which involves making sure that you're protecting the rights of all the participants in the system. You're not just there to win. You have a duty to do justice, and part of that is to do justice in the right way. Ken, maybe you could talk a little bit about, kind of where these values and traditions, these ideals, where do they come from? Are they written down? How does one come to learn these things as a prosecutor?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the short answer is no, they're not written down. But I think you did a good recitation of some of the sort of the things that distinguish being a federal prosecutor from being a lawyer in any other capacity. I mean, as you said, you have an obligation as a federal prosecutor to protect the institution of the criminal justice system. In other words, your job is not just to win a case for your client, but to protect the process and make sure that the process is fair to everybody and that it's perceived as fair, because the criminal justice system only works. Jurors only serve and serve responsibly. People only trust the verdicts, and people will only cooperate and come testify in the judicial system if they feel like that system is fair. And as the chief representative of the government, the one side in a criminal prosecution, the side that's taking action, that has the power to bring criminal cases, it's incumbent on you to act in a way that protects that both the reality and appearance of fairness. And so that's a sort of an additional obligation that a prosecutor has. And then you put your finger on another one, which is sort of a subpart of that, which is there's a duality to your obligation as a prosecutor. You have an obligation not only to work as hard as possible, be as creative and aggressive as the facts and the law allow in pursuit of a conviction, but at the same time, you're equally obligated to protect the rights of the person that you're going after, the person on the other side of your case, i.e. the criminal defendant. Because once again, that system, even if you convict the person, even if that person is guilty of the crime you charged him with and he's convicted of, if you got to that result in an unfair way, then that hurts the system, hurts the credibility of the system. And so it's an interesting additional obligation that one has as a federal prosecutor. So sort of back to the question of, where does one look to see, okay, how should a prosecutor, a young federal prosecutor walks in the door, how should he or she act? How should one actually carry out those responsibilities? And you're right, there's lots of training and there are manuals and all that stuff. But the way that you learn is you learn by watching those people who are ahead of you in the office, who are admired and respected and have earned that respect because they're doing it the right way. And this is just like lots of professions, right? I mean, the ideal doctor, once again, it's not written down somewhere. It's the person who has all the right skills and talents and all that stuff, but also who knows how to conduct himself or herself in a way that earns the respect of their peers. And so it's the same idea in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And so when you sort of learn as a prosecutor, you learn by watching.
What are some of the things that do not characterize sort of the prosecutor that should be modeled, that you should be modeling yourself after?
Yeah, look, I think you watch TV, you see movies, and lawyers are depicted a certain way, and prosecutors are sort of depicted in a way that you sometimes I think that's not accurate. And one of the things is that the idea that to be a successful prosecutor, you got to be a showboater. You got to be sort of over the top, flamboyant in trial, etc. Flashy and theatrical. Look, some of our colleagues who are some of the best prosecutors, had a theatrical streak in them, no question. But that in and of itself is not really the currency that makes you a successful prosecutor in the long run. Channeling your passion, demonstrating that you have that passion so the jurors see that you believe what you're saying, absolutely. But the real touchstone of that, the touchstone of success in a courtroom, is integrity.
You see a lot of prosecutors running out, talk to the press about pending cases, about pending investigations. Was that something that was sort of regarded as a badge of honor and esteem in your experience, Ken?
Yeah, look, and we'll talk about Bob Mueller in a minute, but every time I ended up having a press conference or talked to the press throughout my whole career, he'd call me and call me a showboater. And because he was...
Well, Bob was known for always speaking the truth, Ken.
Yeah, and not speaking to the press. But actually, that was a good lesson that it's better. Look, we all like attention, and there's a place for getting the message out about good law enforcement work. But at the end of the day, what's really important is what happens in the courtroom. The fact that the victim's family in a murder case feels like their rights have been vindicated, that you've fought for them, and that that you've fought a fair fight, and it was a good result. That's more important than getting out there and trumpeting the result of a particular case. So, yeah, just in terms of talking about the things that don't end up being sort of universally admired among prosecutors, that's one of them.
Yeah. No, and I think it's important. I mean, we're trying to highlight the sort of characteristics and values of sort of an ideal. We're not suggesting that everybody is at that level,
Including us.
including us, absolutely. And frankly, one of the kind of professional conceits of prosecutors is sometimes they can be a little self-righteous, and they get preachy, we've all seen that, and you need to guard against it. It's it's a job that can't be done without some humility. Can't be done right without some humility.
Yep.
And that's an
And sometimes the job
underappreciated quality. Yeah.
Sometimes the job teaches you humility too.
Well, that's exactly. Yeah.
I learned that.
Yeah.
And those are important lessons. So look, just in terms of just to tick them off, just some of the things that, and Steve, you and I talked about this, that would sort of are the qualities that we think of, as for sort of the ideal federal prosecutor. Obviously, a focus on public service over sort of personal gain or personal glory. It's obviously not about making money. It's not about promoting yourself. It's about doing the right thing and getting justice. I mean, you're working for the Department of Justice, a federal department that in its name has a value. So your job is to do everything you can in furtherance of that value of justice.
How about politics? Did you, and you were U.S. attorney, I'm sure you occasionally had members of Congress or other political actors try to, weigh in on a case. How did you deal with that?
As with you, because you were a longtime federal public corruption prosecutor, where politics obviously was right in the middle of everything you were doing. It's absolutely critical that as, the head of any office or anybody in an office, that you might have a political view about things that relate to a case. You might have an opinion about, the politics of the defendant, what have you, but that's just got to be parked outside the door. It's really can be hard in some cases, but once federal prosecution is perceived as being a tool of politics, then it loses the trust of the American people. So, as you know, for generations, it's always been important that DOJ prosecutors make it very clear that they're only operating based on the law and the facts, and that to the extent that they're politicians or politics related to the underlying facts of the case, that has nothing to do with the decision making. Because otherwise, once that perception creeps into the system, then prosecutorial discretion, the decisions that prosecutors make, are going to be subject to skepticism and criticism as being based on things other than the law and the facts.
Yeah. I mean, and as you know, Ken, in the public corruption arena in particular, but also obviously in many other areas, the very fact of an investigation can really have an impact on somebody's life. That's also an important part of discretion. You don't just open investigations willy-nilly.
Yeah, it's important. That's all part of the training, but also it's one of those things, some of those lines are not written down anywhere as to what to say and what not to say. And that's why it's important having mentors within the U.S. Attorney's Office and leaders who recognize how important it is to keep politics out of prosecution. And just to sort of tick off the other things I think you and I have talked about that sort of make or key ingredients of a federal prosecutor, obviously honesty and integrity, and that's so important for the legitimacy of the process, but also, frankly, it's what makes you successful. Okay? When you walk into court, so for what we were saying earlier, at the end of the day, jurors and judges aren't going to give you credit for style points. They're not going to give you credit for, being flashy. What matters is that they believe that you're telling them the truth and that you're about getting to the truth. And if you are that way and you convey that, then you're doing your job. And so that's why the touchstone for being a federal prosecutor is having that integrity. And then just a couple other things. Obviously, you know, it's not easy being a federal prosecutor. It's a lot of work. You got to want to do it. You got to have a passion for it. You have to care about law enforcement. You have to care about public safety. You have to care about victims. You know, that's what fuels you. So you need that fire in the belly. And the last thing I think is worth ticking off is you have to have a respect for the institution. You're the one who's helping to either create or destroy the trust that is, you know, the foundation of that system. And so you have to care a lot about the institution, about the norms that have developed over decades and centuries, about how you conduct yourself as a prosecutor. And you have to care a lot about how the institution is perceived by the public, by the courts, because you know that is you're going to leave that legacy when you walk out the door. You either left the place better or worse off than you found it.
Which I think maybe transitions us a little bit to a special person who we both worked with, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how Bob Mueller sort of fits into what we're talking about here.
Yeah, thank you. And this, when we were asked to do this podcast, we were asked to do it about federal prosecutors and then specifically about Bob. And I think that's why you and I sort of jumped at this opportunity, because it's a real honor to talk about Bob. Bob, you know, passed away this March, and he led a career which is both legendary and incredibly impactful. He'd been a prosecutor out in San Francisco back in the 70s. He then was in Boston. I think he was the acting U.S. attorney in Boston, if memory serves. He then came down to Main Justice headquarters here in D.C. and worked for the Attorney General. And then he eventually ended up at the end of the George H.W. Bush administration as the Assistant Attorney General, Senate confirmed position, overseeing the criminal division. So, you know, one of the very top 3 or 4 positions in the whole Justice Department. He then left with the change of administration in January 1993, and then went to a law firm, very prestigious law firm, but didn't remain there very long before he decided he had to come back to public service. And this was early '95, as I recall, and at that time, DC was the murder capital of the world, had more murders per capita here than any other city in the country. And it was a tough time to be a federal prosecutor. It was, you know, you're slinging cases left and right, and a lot of, you know, terrified witnesses and grieving parents and the like. It was just it was tough. Bob decided that's what he wanted to do, even though he'd been the number 3 person at DOJ. Calls Eric Holder, our U.S. attorney at the time, offers to come in. Eric, you know, asked him if he wanted to have some, you know, supervisory position. And Bob said, no, I just want to be a line homicide prosecutor. And he came in and parked himself right down the hall from us. And, you know, we had a lot of great mentors at that time. Mentioned Dave Schertler and others who were tremendous mentors. Bob came in, though, and he sort of, in many ways, set a different standard. It really sort of caught our attention. And you, as I recall, were one of the first people who met with him. And why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for folks who haven't worked within the Justice Department to appreciate how sort of strange and unique the path from being the Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division of the entire Justice Department to have had that job, and then to go back or down the food chain to be a line attorney in the homicide section in the Superior Court divisions. You're not even in federal court of the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. Only somebody who is totally devoid of, you know, kind of illusions of grandeur or you know, kind of ego disease would even think about doing that. And Bob was one of those guys. I mean, he took over my caseload because I, at that point, had been in the homicide section and was moving to a public corruption prosecutorial role. And I was a fairly junior homicide prosecutor. I had an interior office, didn't even have a window. That's what Bob got when he showed up. He got my office. He got my caseload. This guy who used to have 3 secretaries when he was the assistant attorney general of the criminal division. And in addition to raising questions about whether he'd lost his mind to make a move like that, it was, to me, and I think to the others there, it was remarkably inspirational, because here was this guy who was saying, what you're doing as a line prosecutor in DC is sufficiently important and rewarding and meaningful that I want to give up all the money and all the kind of glory and perks that I might enjoy somewhere else and come into the trenches and do the job with you. And it made me not want to leave the homicide section, frankly, although I had already committed to going. It was very clear the job is not about that job was not about status. It was not about money. And he came in, he dug in. I had, some kind of homicide cases from rough parts of town. It was Bobo and Reds beefing over sneakers and somebody got killed. These were not, grand, high profile, transnational crime cases. They were just local homicide cases. And Bob was remarkable. He stepped right in. He was very excited about the transition. Um, and one thing about Bob that I noticed early on, used to talk about this when people would interview for the office for a job. And I was on the hiring committee for many years. And I used to refer to some applicants as having, quote, a pronoun problem. And the pronoun problem would be when they use the word I to talk about things that they had done in the past as opposed to we. And I noticed that Bob never used the word I. He always used the word we when he talked about all these things that he had done. And so, Bob didn't have a pronoun problem. Bob was about the team. Bob was about, he's a Marine running to the sounds of gunfire, literally, in the District of Columbia. So anyways, that was, and that was a really powerful experience, I think, not just for me, but for his colleagues. It really sent a message. So
it did, and you're right. He never used the word "I." It was always "we," and that's the way he conducted himself as a line prosecutor through his whole time. He, went into court with absolute integrity and won the affection and admiration of the judges. He became, a go-to person for the homicide detectives who got it that he was all about doing the job and doing it well and helping them out. He was, became a real teammate with everybody in the homicide section, and he cared a lot. Here's a guy who was perceived as being, older, sort of soldierly, and maybe stiff in certain ways, and he was anything but. He cared about what he was doing. He cared about the people who were involved in the cases. And I remember, for example, one time we had this really incredibly tragic murder at a Starbucks in D.C. It happened to be right up near his house when he was the chief of the homicide section. He got the call, heard the call early in the morning. He went to the scene, and the 3 young kids who'd been killed in a botched robbery, were still there on the scene. And he was there sort of helping to coordinate things. He ended up taking that case on. And he came back into my office afterwards. And, here's a guy who'd been through Vietnam, had been shot in combat at Vietnam. And he was really, he was really touched and upset by what he'd seen about what had happened to these 3 young kids. And just gave me an insight into how much he cared about these cases. He got it that there are human beings behind these cases. And he shared that with us, the other prosecutors, but also with the detectives. And to that point, we got a special guest I want to mention. You're talking, 2 of us are federal prosecutors, but the people who really do the work in these homicide cases were the homicide detectives. And it just so happens that on the day that Steve and I were doing this podcast, an old friend of ours, Guy Middleton, who was a homicide lieutenant back at the time that Bob served as prosecutor, was in town, and he was kind enough to join us for a few minutes. Okay, Guy, good to see you. How are you today?
Good to see you. Great, doing fine. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. As I was telling you, Steve Bunnell and I are doing a podcast right now about sort of the ideals behind being a federal prosecutor. And one of the ways that we're showing those ideals is going back and talking about our old friend Bob Mueller. And with you in town, just by happenstance, the same time we were doing this podcast, we thought we couldn't pass up the opportunity to have you give us a few thoughts about Bob, because I know you two work very closely together.
We did.
So first, if you would just introduce yourself and what you did at MPD and the kind of work you did with homicide in DC.
Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me to the podcast. I'm looking forward to chipping in where and how I can. I'm a native Washingtonian. I did 29 years on the Metropolitan Police Department. About half of those years were spent in the homicide branch as a sergeant and then as a lieutenant, responsible for investigating murders in D.C. at what was at the time a very, very, very high level of homicides occurring in D.C.
Yeah, and so take us back now. I guess that's in the early mid '90s.
Yep.
And we had the pleasure of working together, as did Steve and you. And DC had, I think, upwards of 450 murders a year. And
That's right.
I recall you guys were oftentimes going to 5 murders a night.
Yeah, they were nonstop. There was no shortage of murder investigations, and unfortunately, it was like triage. You had to work on the cases that offered the most promise, to close the cases you could, and work on the other ones at some other time. But there were so many murders, and they were so frequent, and all hours of the day. Of course, overnight was the worst, but evening tour, day tour, it didn't matter. They were happening all hours of the day and night. And of course, we had limited resources, limited homicide detectives, limited forensics examiners, limited morgue pathologists, and we just did the best we could under the circumstances until eventually the murders started to decline.
Yeah, and thanks to your good work.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of the work in terms of solving the murders and then convicting those responsible for the murders was done in conjunction with the prosecutors and the U.S. attorney's offices. And the key team
Absolutely.
players, the teammates, were the detective and police officers who worked the case, and the federal prosecutor who was assigned the case. Right.
That's right. Yep.
So you worked with a lot of prosecutors along the way, dealing with this wave of violence, and a fellow by the name of Bob Mueller walks through the door.
Bob Mueller shows up in the homicide section of the U.S. Attorney's Office, and he made an impression on me, as I'm sure he did all the other homicide investigators at the time, because Bob was just a no-nonsense, straightforward, hardworking prosecutor, a public servant, and he came into that office looking to understand and prosecute these homicide defendants, suspects, and with the help of his expertise and the help of the homicide detectives who came to trust and look up to him, was able to get a lot of convictions and shut down a lot of these, some what I would call repeat killers. At the time, some people might have labeled them serial killers. I don't know what that definition means to people, but in a sense, you could say that we would arrest people who may have committed two, three, four, five, six murders. Maybe we couldn't pin them all on them, but we knew that they more than likely had done them.
So when Bob walks in, you're dealing with a lot of other AUSAs, federal
Mhm.
prosecutors, who are sort of more like me at the time, kind of a youngster, a little wet behind the ears, you know, 30 something or whatever.
Yeah,
Bob walks in, he's a little different cat, right?
no question.
Okay.
Bob is clearly older than most of the prosecutors that we have been used to working with by at least 10 years, probably slightly more. But you could tell he was seasoned, he was experienced, he knew what he was doing, and a lot of us homicide detectives at the time were, kind of helping to train prosecutors in how to go about investigating and prosecuting homicide suspects. And we didn't need to do that with Bob.
Mhm.
Bob needed to understand the dynamics of prosecuting murders in Washington, D.C., given at the time the record number of murders, but also the way you had to massage and work with witnesses who weren't really keen on testifying in open court about anything, never mind an open murder. That trust starts with the detectives, and then the detectives take the case once they get an arrest warrant, takes the case to the prosecutors, and then you have to rebuild that trust and relationship with the prosecutors. And Bob never skipped a beat when it came to that process. He understood the witness position. He understood what it took to get a successful prosecution of the case, and he understood how to work with homicide detectives who are, I will say, aren't necessarily the easiest people to work with when they're trying to get a case prosecuted.
You guys are tremendous professionals. Never worked with anybody who was more dedicated than a homicide detective.
Absolutely.
But you pushed your agenda, and that's
Yep.
what you're supposed to do. And so let me just ask you then. He comes in. He's obviously, as I said, sort of a different cat. Um, you guys are homicide detectives. You've got your own ethos. How did you end up getting along? You as a sort of the collective of homicide detectives. How did you end up getting along with Bob, both as a line prosecutor and then when he was the chief of the section?
Yeah. I think everybody enjoyed working with Bob. Everybody liked Bob. Everybody liked his work ethic, is what stuck out to all of us. He's just full steam ahead. They say, pardon the line, but they say you don't join the Marines, you become a Marine. And Bob Mueller was definitely, unequivocally, a Marine in that office doing the job that he was doing, not only as a line prosecutor, but also as the chief of the homicide section there in the U.S. Attorney's Office. All about business, all about successfully accomplishing the mission. And all of us in homicide appreciated that ethos, and we really, really, really enjoyed working with him.
The last question: what do you think motivated? What drove Bob Mueller?
Well, I obviously was not a personal friend of Bob Mueller. I didn't hang out with him socially. So I can only speak from my perspective. And from my perspective, Bob was like a lot of other federal prosecutors that I've met. Not all, but a lot of them are driven by doing what's right. They're driven by seeing justice done. You got to keep in mind, and you might not want me to say this, but I'll tell you, you got to keep in mind, federal prosecutors could very easily be private attorneys somewhere else making a whole boatload of money. And when you choose to take an oath to be a public servant and serve in, in this case, in DC, as a local prosecutor, you're not making as much money as you could be making if you took your skills somewhere else. So it's really a dedication to the work, to the job that you're hired to do. And we as detectives, of course, we feel that way, but it's encouraging and refreshing when you are working with federal prosecutors who feel the exact same way that you feel and know that something has to be done and you're the one that has to do it.
Very well said.
Thanks.
So thanks so much. Thanks for joining us. Thanks
Thanks.
for sharing your memories of Bob Mueller, and
Sure.
thank you for your service
Well,
in
thank you,
Washington
Ken.
D.C. It made a difference.
Likewise.
All right, take care, guy.
Okay, thanks.
Ken, one of the great things about having Guy here is he serves to highlight what I think is a less known part of Bob Mueller's career, which is the time he spent in the homicide section in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and a number of former colleagues of his in the U.S. Attorney's Office during that period recently published a letter about him, which I think echoes many of the things we've been talking about. But I just like to sort of briefly note a few of the things that they mention in there, and how Bob, despite being, as you point out, kind of a patrician guy who certainly didn't grow up in some of the neighborhoods where these homicides were taking place, nonetheless threw himself into the work and immediately developed rapport with all the key sort of people that are involved in this, the civilian witnesses, the the other prosecutors who the colleagues, the night shift detectives, and the letter describes him as just an exceptional homicide prosecutor. And I think it really captures the 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 empathy and the emotional demands of that role. And I think the last paragraph actually of the letter is particularly um, moving, and maybe you'd like to read it.
Yeah, you mentioned the word button down. He was a button down guy, but as the letter points out, he embraced the disorder, the barely controlled chaos in the homicide section, and was able to thrive within it. But yeah, the end of the letter just says Bob went on to arguably more important jobs after a few years, ultimately being FBI director, for example. But he often said that he never had a better job than working for justice as an assistant United States attorney. And he was always very proud of his service in Washington, D.C. And his colleagues then say, we are also proud of our service together, and we remain thankful that Bob joined our ranks during that trying time, and that he was and always will be one of us. So I think the point of the letter comes through very clearly, which is, I think, the point that you and I have tried to make, is that Bob really reflected the best of federal prosecutors. He reflected as close as you can get to that ideal that we all strive, never completely succeed, but all strive to emulate. And I think we all count ourselves very proud to have served with him.
Yeah. And I want to thank you as somebody who I know was quite close to Bob and worked closely with him in many capacities over the years, for sharing your thoughts and your recollections. I think this is a particularly important time for us to reflect on, as you describe, an aspiration, but a very important ideal of our criminal justice system, which is to, have prosecutors who sort of live up to the finest traditions of the Justice Department, who exercise enlightened and sound prosecutorial discretion. And there was really nobody who did it better than Bob Mueller.
Amen. Thanks, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for listening today. This is Steve Bunnell on behalf of the Steady State Sentinel, encouraging you to tune in again. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to the Steady State Sentinel podcast. Don't miss out on more insights and exposés from America's premier global security experts.
Also, subscribe to our Substack at substack.com/@steadystate1 and follow our social media, and join us right here next week for another exciting edition.
The Steady State is a nonprofit organization working to sustain our democracy and national security.
Join us and support our mission by visiting www.thesteadystate.org.